I'm
Great.
working on a little hand sewing project. I don't have to look at the slides since they're burned into my brain, so
Awesome.
don't think I'm not interested, guys.
Awesome. So I'm Charlie Munford. You guys know me. This is Agential Topics. Uh, this is put on by Talking Octopus, which is an organization dedicated to building a physical model of agential biology. And today I'm going to give a presentation on Karl Popper's epistemology and how it applies to biology and to the problems that we've been studying. So I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to try not to lean too much on the PowerPoint, but I think it will hopefully be helpful. Can you guys see that?
Yes, says Zoom. There. So
So
Carl,
Zoom is Karl Popper's biology. Okay.
yes.
Got it.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so just to get some basics together here, we're going to be talking about Karl Popper's epistemology. He was a 20th century philosopher. He published his first major work in 1934, which is called Logik der Forschung, or it's the logic of scientific discovery is the translation. And it's a theory that deals with induction and deduction. So first, I just want to go over what that is in Popper's terms. So when we talk about induction, we're talking about the step in the process where we invent a theory. And we'll get into what that means in a second. But the concept of induction is that there's logic in that step. There's a logical process where you go from observation or facts to a theory. And the idea is that a theory emerges from facts if you just observe the world carefully. And that's the first step in building a scientific concept. So opposed to that, or very different from that, is deduction. And deduction is when it happens the other way. So facts emerge logically from the terms of a theory, tautologically, because the theory defines what a fact will be. So, for example, if we say a photon is a discrete piece of light, then we can make observations and call them photons. And if we didn't have that definition, we couldn't make any observations. And since the observations are just instances of the theory, they're tautologies. So if we call things photons, then it makes it possible to see them and observe them. So, and Popper's point of view would be that we are able to look at the world only after we have a theory that tells us what anything is to look at. And otherwise, it doesn't count as an observation unless you have a theory that defines what it is. So in this presentation, I'm going to prove to you, hopefully, that an organism's body/mind is a theory of the world that learns through deductive logic and not through induction. And this whole concept I call epistolution. Now, Mary wanted me to explain right here that
But Mary doesn't necessarily have to prevail.
the stakes, well, the stakes in this conversation, what I'm trying to prove here, have to do with Shannon information and the distinction between Shannon information and what I would call Bateson information. So Bateson defined information as a difference that makes a difference. In other words, something that's meaningful. And it's a mystery where meaning comes from. That's sort of been the topic of most of these meetings. But Shannon information alone, I'm going to try to prove to you that Shannon information alone doesn't define any meaning, and it requires something else. It requires a conjecture or an explanation. So the general view of science that probably 99% of scientists still ascribe to, and it's been ascribed to since definitely since Francis Bacon and possibly since Aristotle, is that Baconian induction happens. And this is aimed at episteme, which is verified true beliefs. So scientists often believe that they're aiming for well-corroborated theories. And they think of this task of a scientist as to add to the body of observable facts and then use those to make only confident statements that amount to, scientific theories that are confident statements based on observable facts. So you see that the cliche often, such and such is scientifically proven. So my argument will be in this presentation that this is a mistaken view of science, and it's a mistaken view of how logic enters the process of scientific reasoning. And my claim is that making this mistake drastically slows down progress in science because it makes the process of making conjectures far too conservative, because scientists assume that they have to only make logical conjectures, and Popper shows that that's false. There's actually no logic in the conjecture step at all, and conjectures are not rationally justified by facts. So we should avoid these constraints, and we should conjecture freely and wildly, as wildly as we want to, and focus on coming up with good explanations that can be falsified. So the problem situation for Popper was that he was writing in 1934, and so what had happened was, roughly, I guess it was about 300 years worth of Newton had been the best corroborated theory in the history of the world, right? So all of Western civilization was built on Newtonian mechanics and the steam engine, and all of the technologies that had been invented up to that point were based on Newton's mechanics. And then suddenly Einstein refuted the whole thing and replaced the entire system of Newtonian mechanics with his mechanics. And so it was a powerful body blow for the idea that well corroborated theories are the basis of scientific rationality. And this went back to David Hume. So this recalled David Hume's observation that no number of singular statements could ever logically entail a universal statement. So no matter how many instances you see of swans, all swans are white, is not entailed by the observation of white swans, because at any moment around any corner you could find a swan of a different color. And in fact, they did find black swans when they explored New Zealand. So Hume had raised this question, and people had basically ignored it. So the typical response is that each confirming instance increases the probability that the theory is true. And so that's bullshit, because there are an infinite number of true consequences of a false statement. So here I'll just give an example, or a couple of examples. I make a false statement: I am a lizard. Well, there's an infinite number of true observations you can make to corroborate that statement, right? I have lungs, I breathe air, move around in the daytime and not at night, etc. So there's a really annoying habit that people have of ignoring that observation, ignoring the fact that there are a lot of true consequences of a false theory, and in fact, an infinite number of true consequences. So people ignore that, and they say things like, there's no evidence that the earth is flat. And of course, that's not true. All the evidence points to the earth being flat, except for the very selective few facts that refute the theory that the earth is flat. And you have to make very careful observations and set up experiments in order to refute the theory that the earth is flat, because there's so many common sense observations that people can post online that indicate that the earth is flat. So again, deduction is where logic actually resides in the scientific process. So deduction is based on the truth of tautologies. So when you use deduction, you have to start with a theory that is that can be logically refuted, right, based on tautological observations. So if you say a virus is an entity, self-replicating, a non-self-replicating, genetic structure, then you expose your theory to the danger of refutation, because it's very, very clear what sort of observation could be made that would prove your theory wrong. So it's very clean and very efficient, because your theory can be completely discarded if you find one instance of a virus that replicates itself, right? So either you have to change the theory, or you can just toss it out and make a new one.
Question.
Yes.
How can you ensure that instead you don't come to the conclusion that the thing that was replicating was obviously not a virus, because viruses are non-self-replicating entities?
Charlie's an answer.
Right. Yeah, it's a perfect question. Yeah, so Popper foresaw this type of evasion. And so in a moment, we're going to get into what makes a good theory, what makes a good explanation, and how the sort of methodology that this implies. But Popper's basic point in Logic der Forschung is that knowledge is built by conjecture and refutation, not by induction. And so he says, induction never happens. It's impossible. So the problem of induction solved. Popper solved it. There's no path to a theory from observations, because you'd need an infinite set of observations, and they'd have to cover the entire universe and every other universe. And so you can't do that. So there's no way to justify or logically build a theory from observations. However, conjectures are very useful and can come from anywhere. So Popper's totally agnostic about where they come from. They can come from a dream, a flash of inspiration, a mistake, an error, a child, anything. But it's a scientific conjecture if it can be falsified, either because it conflicts with itself logically, or it conflicts with facts that are available through experiment. So an example of a theory that's not put together this way is, let's say we define a species as a set of organisms that can make viable offspring together. So if we define species that way, then we have to either admit that, since a lion and a tiger can make viable offspring, they're the same species, or we have to exclude people, a man and a woman who are Rh positive and negative. I'm not quite sure what that is, but Mary suggested it. So it's a man and a woman, human, who are not sexually compatible. They can't make viable offspring. So they would be different species according to that definition. So that those are the ways that the theory can be falsified. However, there's a problem that Richard just anticipated. So it's always logically possible to evade refutation by challenging the validity of any observation, or by ad hoc changes to the conjecture. So it's since we know that singular statements are not logically impermeable, then we can always challenge them and say, oh no, that's not a black swan, it's just standing in the shade, or someone painted it, or anyway, it's a large duck, it's not a swan. And so Popper was like keenly aware of this, and he posed the critical aspect of scientific methodology as making good explanations that are easy to falsify, that are clean enough that it's very clear, like the virus example, it's very clear what sort of evidence would prove it wrong. So obviously the key to this is objectivity and testing intersubjectively between observers. And so you have to, develop instructions for the reproduction of experiments that are very clean and easy to work with, and obvious to all, right? Things like the Weissman barrier, for example, should be refuting, a theory of biology. Anyway, so Popper really focused on, this is an acronym that I made up. So PLITH, this is my description of what makes a good explanation. And the inner part, logical, informative, and testable, comes straight from Popper. Parsimonious is an addition that the philosopher Nicholas Maxwell added, because he made the point, very good point, that say you have this good definition of a virus, right? Well, there's no logical it's a very parsimonious definition and theory of what a virus is, but there's no logical reason to prefer that to a less parsimonious theory. So you could say a virus is a non-self-replicating genetic structure, except for in the year 2300, it self-replicates, and then in 2301, it becomes non-self-replicating again, right? So you can add useless, irrelevant complications to the theory, and there's no logical reason you should prefer parsimonious ones. But he argues, I think successfully, that that's a sort of a priori assumption that we need in order to use our minds and effectively. And so we for no logical reason have to prefer parsimonious theories to non-parsimonious theories that are equally powerful. So and then obviously logical. So the theory can't conflict with itself. So like, matter can't be a wave and a particle at the same time. That's contradictory. So that's not a good theory. It needs to be informative. So it needs to, tell us something about the world. A theory like it will rain may be true, but it's refutable, right? I mean, it's falsifiable, but it's not informative at all, because it doesn't narrow the concept down enough. Testability is how Popper drew the line, not between sense and nonsense, like the logical positivists that he opposed. He drew the line between science and metaphysics, or science and non-science, at falsifiability or testability. So he felt like metaphysics is quite useful, but it's not science, because it can't be decided. The questions that are raised can't be decided by experiments. So assertions like people are ruled by other people are metaphysical, untestable, quite useful. Like, explain the world, they're logical, informative, etc., but they're not testable. So they're non-science. And David Deutsch, who's a big Popperian and very popular, sort of summarized these four things: parsimonious, logical, informative, and testable, as hard to vary. So like the theory can't easily be wiggled from side to side, right? There's something about it that's sort of well formed for the purpose that it serves, and that's kind of vague, so I just put that at the end. But I remember this by this acronym PLITH. So when we talk about testability, falsification, I just mentioned that Popper, divides ideas between science and metaphysics, or science and non-science, with testability. But he pointed out that many ideas in metaphysics make sense and are useful, and they may often become scientific ideas later when they become testable. So, for example, atomism, when it was invented by Democritus, pre-Socratic, it was not testable, and then it became testable for a while, and then it was refuted. So we've got, it sort of went through the whole life cycle. So he thinks of metaphysics as very useful and not nonsense at all. And I would just point out that our learning first theory of life is currently metaphysical theory, but hopefully will become scientific soon when we do our experiments. We figure out what makes it tick. But ideas like the climate shall change, they're unfalsifiable. Like when it was global warming, it was falsifiable. Now it's climate change, and so it's no longer falsifiable. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just not science. So the big difference between Popper's epistemology and induction is that now we're going to get into this deep thing. So maybe I should pause for a second and see if anyone has questions quickly.
Well, I mean, I don't have questions, but so let me just let me clarify one thing. So
Okay.
what we're looking at here is specifically the way of knowing, which is science. We also have reason, we also have imagination and insight, and understanding that some of our knowing is simply not amenable to science and some is. This is Ian McGilchrist.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I needed to start with science. Like, it's a theory of all knowledge, but I needed to start with science and sort of get that part clear so that we could sort of work down to the deeper implications and consequences of it. So
So
the
I was just wondering real quickly, are you familiar with the person abduction? Which
yes,
kind of is,
yeah,
okay, because
totally.
I think that's something that
Yep.
that's important. That's another form of logic that leads you into ternary logic, and it shouldn't be completely ignored. But, well, anyway.
Yeah,
Well,
we're gonna get
Wayne,
there. Yeah,
yeah,
totally.
Charlie and I talked about that, and I said that I think that most of what we're doing is abduction. We're letting our brains be abducted by aliens
Totally.
because we're making wild conclusions based on really bad evidence.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean the temptation to look at the world in the inductivist way. I mean, I think we'll get into person, man, but I think it's basically it's a nicer version of inductivism, but we'll get there.
I
So-
think there's a direct parallel between this whole issue and the very basic sensory function, like a retina that has a bunch of photosensors in an array, but it doesn't see anything unless behind it there's some kind of detector that's looking for edges or corners or symmetries or whatever. But you have to build those symmetry detectors into the system, otherwise the photocells by themselves are totally meaningless. And so the only way an organism can see is by way of the sensors that are built in as a presumption of the kind of shapes they should be looking out for. So it's the same issue, but all squashed into a lower level.
I think you're right, Stephen. I think that
Totally.
that those sensors are creating the theory.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah,
that's where
yeah,
that's
exactly.
where our ability
Exactly.
to explain things falls apart. How the fuck are they doing that?
Yeah,
well,
totally. Rich,
they're not.
did you have a question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, I mean, they're not, right? Because the sensors don't directly perceive reality. They're only making conjectures which can later turn out to be false. So I found that really useful, Charlie. Thank you very much. I understand why Popper says there's no such thing as induction, but it surprises me that he says that. It seems to me that there's no such thing as induction which is logically sound. But my sense of the word was, but there is induction. Induction does exist. We do it all the time. It just isn't logically sound.
Correct.
That's called abduction.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. I call it epistolation. But yes, it's exactly. And that's why I think Popper really underpins what we're doing here. Like, because there is a mechanism that makes conjectures, and the conjectures are sensible. They're not random, right? So that's why they seem logical. And we've got to it implies or requires, some other process that is why Popper is so exciting. And also this part of Popper's work is not well known, because this guy Hans Joachim Neumann was he only published Popper's like sort of solidified thoughts on biology in 2012, and it's this little book that it's this book, Karl Popper and the Two New Secrets of Life, which is just fantastic. And I emailed Nyman to see if he would join our meeting today, but he wouldn't join. But he was really he's just a super nice guy. And anyway, this I'll get into some of the things Popper says that clarify that a little bit. So the big difference between Popperian epistemology and induction or Bayesian reasoning is that when you have a good explanation with Popper, all the other explanations can be logically dismissed and they can disappear. So there's an incredibly clean efficiency to this. Like, it happens really fast. And what we're looking for with organisms and cognition is how to learn really, really quickly with super sparse data sets. So the idea is all swans are white. As soon as you have one example of a black swan or any color swan, you can dismiss the whole theory. It's gone forever for a scientist. Like, it can remain in pop culture and it's good enough for, children's storybooks and that sort of thing, but it's not, it's no longer the truth that you can rely on, right?
What's gone? The incorrect conjecture or all the other explanations that weren't so good?
Both. Yeah, both. You have to have you have a new, better explanation that it says that the swan can be at least two different colors, right?
Okay.
And it's no longer, it's not immune from falsification, but it hasn't been falsified yet. So as soon as something's been falsified, it needs to be tossed out. It needs to be tossed out because anything's better than a contradictory theory. So Bayesians think about knowledge in a completely different way. They think of it as competing hypotheses, and data that comes in updates the likelihood of any of these competing hypotheses being true. And so presumably there's like an infinite number of competing hypotheses, and data, unsupervised learning is like finding correlations and building knowledge that way, or you have specific, training data, et cetera. But anyway, the idea of competing hypotheses is the only time hypotheses are competing in Popper's scheme is when they need to be tested, right? So you need to test between two different hypotheses. You can't, every test is supposed to rule out one conjecture or another. So it really annoys Popperians like myself when you see scientists making statements like the preponderance of evidence suggests life began in deep sea vents. So when you think about what statement is being made, so it's basically a meta conjecture that's self-contradictory, right? So they're saying both they're saying that both the theory where it's impossible that life began in deep sea vents and the theory where it's possible that life began in deep sea vents or it's impossible that it began anywhere else, are competing, and there's evidence that needs to be weighed. And so that's, again, the backwards view of what evidence is, right? So evidence is defined by the theory. So all you need is one refutation of the idea that life began in deep sea vents, and that makes that explanation disappear entirely. So that kind of statement, the preponderance of the evidence or the bulk of the evidence, the weight of the evidence, et cetera, is a shorthand, and maybe it's just, a shorthand, but people treat it as the way that rationality works, and that's not the way that rational.
Well, what if some life began in deep sea vents and other life didn't? I mean, that's also a possibility. I'm not. Maybe it's just a bad example.
I mean, it needs to be a falsifiable, right? It needs to be not both, right? They're both.
It's not a good conjecture to apply Popper to.
Yeah, it's not a scientific conjecture if it can't be falsified, right?
This is my problem. This is a problem I have with. This is a problem I have with the climate change theories. What does preponderance of evidence means? It means that you had a hypothesis and you went out and you did specific trials that gave you specific results. But what about all the trials you didn't do? What about the evidence that was not even looked for?
Exactly. That's exactly the problem. So if you have an old theory that's wrong, then 10 million observations will be made that confirm that theory, right? And then one observation proves it completely wrong, just like Arthur Eddington in Africa proving Newtonian mechanics wrong, right? There's only one observation there. So the preponderance of the evidence still supports, if you're going to think of it that way, preponderance of the evidence, of course, is supporting Newtonian mechanics. So we're not going to say the jury's out, is Einstein right or wrong? We're going to say this experiment is sufficient to prove him wrong, and it doesn't prove him wrong. So it is a better explanation. And so it doesn't matter how many times we saw, Newtonian mechanics be confirmed, because there's no logical reason why a confirmation makes any difference. So
I would just point out one aspect, and it gets back to what Richard was saying about induction. Popper's logic is beautiful and flawless as far as I can see. But there are limits to the use of having a structure that is absolute. In other words, induction may not exist, but we use it and it provides solutions to problems for us in the world as we experience it. And the same thing, the preponderance of evidence suggests life begins in deep sea vents is not a useless statement, even though it contains within itself contradictions. The statement is helpful if you have to decide where to put resources in a search that can't go everywhere at the same time. So it becomes a form of problem solving, and that form of logic has use also. It's not elegantly solid, but it can still be useful.
I think
I think the way that the Popperians would rephrase that is that there's a stronger explanation that suggests life began in deep sea vents. And then they would point to Plith of the explanation, right? So they would say it's parsimonious, it's logical, it's informative, it's testable, it's not been refuted by tests, so forth. So they would say that's a stronger explanation than the theory that life didn't begin in
Okay.
events, right? So they wouldn't have to weigh one against the other. It would be like, this is a better explanation on its own terms. So it's really fast and efficient, because as soon as you refute the old theory, anyone that comes up with a better explanation that hasn't been refuted yet has the better explanation. Like, you can move to the new theory immediately. You don't have to spend 40 or 50 years arguing about whether neo-Darwinism is true. You can just refute it and try and imagine a new one.
Charlie, it seems to me that there's a bit of Harper that I mean, I would love to have had a personal conversation with him and ask him this question. It seems like he's a bit of a romantic. He's a bit of a sort of a Goethean who, believes that there's some mystic process of theoretical ideas emerging from the inchoate cosmos or something, and
Well, so what I might throw in there is that, if you look at in the Gilchrist epistemology, which has to do with, the split brain that's pretty much pervasive in all higher animals, at least since 500 million years ago. And, the function of it, the way it works is that you really need two kinds of functions from the brain. You need the analytic side that allows you to get things. I need to grab this. And you need the holistic side that allows you to, say, evade predators.
Totally.
You can see the big picture of what's going on. Well, when we're talking about science and reason, we're talking about analysis and we're talking about deduction. When we're talking about conjectures and, and where they come from, this is more from holistic understanding, which we would call, say, imagination and insight.
intuition,
Totally.
mystic insight.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, totally. Richard, did you have
Yeah, I wondered if you could help me analyze in these terms this thing that keeps pissing me off, which is evolution by natural selection is true, right? That pisses me off because, whilst evolution by natural selection occurs, the idea that it explains all of the complexity and diversity of life that it claims to explain is not, right? And so what kind of mistake are people making when they say evolution by natural selection is true?
It's not informative enough, right? It's logical, and I suppose it's testable, but it's not informative enough, right? It explains part of the mystery, but not the whole thing. And actually, in a couple of slides, Popper's going to tell us exactly what
The right answer is sure. So what?
Just tell them to read this
Yeah.
book. It's very informative of all of the problems. Have you guys all read this? I wish Perry would come
Oh
to
yeah,
these
Perry.
meetings.
Yeah, Perry Marshall's book is it's fantastic.
It's funny. I
think-
have Bill and
Oh.
Arthur's books right here too.
it relates.
Yeah.
In the living part of the universe, unless it's all living, well, the opposites coexist. Things that are there probably are very few, if any, universals. Paradox is there if if you could actually see the whole thing. You can't work with it logically, so it doesn't work within scientific systems. And this is sort of one of the things that one of my favorites, what Rosen was talking about. When he was talking about the insufficiency of these kind of systems. So as long as we're limiting ourselves to what we can know with science and reason and binary logic, Popper's great.
Well, I think that Popper, so let me get to the cool part, because you guys are pointing to really good like weaknesses or gaps in what Popper's saying. Like Popper didn't solve cognition, right? I mean, he didn't, he solved the problem of induction, but he didn't solve what is thinking. And so, there's obviously another mechanism at work, and we all know that, and we're trying to figure it out. But Popper's aware of that too. And so there's this like, if you just push Popper a little further than he had time in his lifetime to go, and just take his theory seriously and apply it in all the domains where it works, then you see that basically he's invented a learning first theory of evolution. So now we're going to get into biology. So Popper leaves open this question, where do conjectures come from, right? So we don't know. Like he doesn't know. He doesn't really apply that. He doesn't try to speculate like it's the unconscious or it's some sort of math that we don't know or whatever. He doesn't really care about that. He says theories are products of the mind. Like they can be products of inspiration, dreams, hallucinations, mistakes, whatever. They're products of the mind. But if you push him, he was pushed and he went further. So he said, okay, in order to have observations, you have to have a theory, right? So Popper, what do you begin with, right? Because are you born with a theory? And he said, yeah, absolutely. You're born with a theory. So they're inborn expectations. Your eyes and your ears, your body, the morphology of organisms is itself expectation. It's a conjecture, right? So we would read that as products of the mind. We would read as products of the body/mind, the indistinguishable, biological system, right? That's both body and mind. And when you look at it that way, then it's completely compatible with Darwinism. If we think of Darwinism as trial and error, like random mutations or whatever source of changes that are tried out as conjectures, and then the ones that are erroneous are discarded immediately. Very efficient, right? The mistakes get weeded out. So he saw Darwinism as totally a sort of embodiment of another form of this conjecture and refutation. And you can sort of think of an organism as a conjecture, a physical instantiation of a conjecture, because when we open our eyes for the first time, we already have eyes, right? We were already an organism. So they're already inborn expectations. And so in this unpublished essay that Nyman published in 2012, 20 years after Popper died, he publishes this essay finally, where it's a thought experiment. It's called A World Without Natural Selection, but with Problem Solving. So I'm going to kind of try to, Mary says I need to explain this a little better. So I'm going to try to really do this justice. So the thought experiment here is that all the organisms in our world are born, and then some of them reproduce and some of them don't, right? And we call that natural selection. So differential reproduction is natural selection. So the world is filled with the offspring of the ones that succeeded. So Popper imagines a different world where all the same offspring are tried. All the trials are in place, right? Every offspring, every organism that was ever born in our world is also born in this other world, but there are no errors. Everything survives forever. It's just an expanding world, expanding universe of infinite resources, and they just survive forever, right? They keep on wiggling around and living. And so he points out that in this world, there's no such thing as selection pressure, right? Everything that came about in our world came about in this world as well, right? And But the only difference is that the things that didn't make it in our world make it in this other world. So in this other world, the lineage of life that we see as the tree of life is there. It's exactly the same, but it's only one out of a much, much, much larger tree of life that ever came into existence, right? And so what he's pointing out through this thought experiment is that there's actually no pressure that's being exerted by removing these failures, right? So the lack of the failures, yeah, it changes the physical environment in terms of competition and resources, et cetera, but it doesn't actively cause the ones that are left to change in any way, right? It's not the source of it's not the instigation of their changes. It might be opening up resources for them, but it's not an active cause. And so he posits a learning first theory. So he calls neo-Darwinism passive Darwinism. And he says in this passive version of this, all that matters is the random mutation of DNA and the external environment, right? That's what determines the course of evolution. And he said that's completely wrong. What's determining the course of evolution is the activity and the knowledge of organisms. So in other words, organisms themselves contain this agency, this active process that's giving them knowledge, and that's what's driving evolution. So he's sort of friendly to Lamarckism. He's not like claiming Lamarckism is necessarily the path, but he's pointing out that there is knowledge and activity in organisms, and the way that they develop is a consequence of that. So
okay, that's
you guys with me?
Complicated but fascinating, and I want to make sure that I get it. Can I have a go at saying it back to you?
Absolutely.
So the whether or not you remove the organisms that fail doesn't actively change the organisms that survive. So the sequence of changes in the organisms that survive, in the lineages that are there that survive, is not caused by selection.
Right.
Not caused by the removal of the losers. The thing that changes the characteristics of the things we're interested in is the agency of the things themselves in those lineages.
Right.
Amazing.
Yeah. So amazing, right?
That
this
really is a cognitive theory of evolution.
Yeah.
Now, what I don't get is how does so I see what he's saying about how neo-Darwinism doesn't provide the explanation that people think it does, but his thought experiment doesn't provide an explanation that links up with biology as we know it either, right?
Right.
Because without a Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics, we don't have a way for the acquired knowledge to get into the next generation.
Well, culture.
But there's a lot of different ways that
culture.
Lamarck type things. Yeah, culture is one of them, but there's increasing experimental evidence of all different types of mechanisms that are sort of Lamarckian. They're just not genetic. One of the big problems is we have this crazy idea that it's all about genetics. And, when really DNA is just a part of a toolbox. It's glorified to this.
Nobody here is going to make the case.
No, I'm sure not.
But I think Papa would say, but I'm not, I didn't say I was going to make a case. I was going to demonstrate disproof and how it works.
Totally.
Well, I think there's a big hand wave in the words you say, well, of course, we're going to discount, competition, between organisms and a limited resource, Well, when you wave that away, you're kind of like waving a lot of things away because there is competition between organisms. And the whole basis of the principles of life is that they're all competing for limited resources.
You don't have to wave it away. You just have to say that's a part of the story. And some of us think it's actually a relatively small part of the story.
Right, because there's
if you
chance.
follow it more than one generation, then it's a huge part of the story.
But there's a lot of ways that embodied knowledge that occurs during the life of organisms can be transferred between generations, including culture and communities, including niche building and
including
developmental
epigenetic,
niche building.
Well,
And
well,
including
Popper was
symbiogenesis,
trying
evolutionist
to,
cooperation.
yeah, Popper was trying to make sense of this too in the later like decade of his life, and he wrote this little piece that's also in this Nyman book about Lamarckism, and he just noticed in that there was such thing as reverse transcription. So he's like they've been the theory has been assuming that there's no path from RNA back to DNA, and now we know that's false. And it was just in the letter, but he was noticing that there was, that there was possibly a
but not from
mechanism.
proteins to RNA.
I'm sorry. Right,
But
from protein to
from
RNA.
proteins to RNA.
Right, totally. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying that's, I'm just saying that's where Popper was,
So it's fine, of course, that Popper's thought experiment isn't a complete theory of cognition first or learning first evolution, but I'm interested to spell out the ways in which it's not, nonetheless. So whilst I agree with Wayne that nobody here is going to imagine that all the information is in the genes, genetic evolution does occur, and there is information in it. And it is the case that the genotypes of zebras have a strong correlation with zebras, and the genotype of aardvarks have a strong correlation with aardvarks, right? So you can't ignore the information that's in the genes, even though there are other mechanisms of information transfer. So if you wanted to have a learning first theory of evolution that depends on the cognitive capabilities of organisms to problem solve within their lifetime, you'd still need to explain that correlation between genotypes and phenotypes.
Do you think genetic assimilation does it though?
I think it does if everything within the organism is reversible, right? So if you say, well, this organism has learned how to do something, like a Hinton and Nolan model of the Baldwin effect. This organism has learned how to do something. So if a genetic change occurred at random, but that happened to reduce the amount of learning required, then it would assimilate that phenotype that had been learned first.
Right. And if a bad mutation occurred, it would be eliminated in that new lifestyle. And it might not have been bad in the old lifestyle.
Yeah. I think there's more work to do there, though. If a better account is to say that organisms orchestrate the activity of their genes, and that's how they do that. That's how they do that within lifetime adaptation, or it's one of the ways in which they do that. Right. And if they've changed the activity of their genes, then assimilating the change in activity of the genes is much easier. It doesn't rely on genetic changes making up a new way to do it that was done by some other mechanism during the lifetime, right? Yeah. Okay.
Well said. Well said, Richard.
You're talking about the different ways in which organisms can reorganize their genes in a moment of crisis, like, for example, the way Barbara McClintock's work.
Yeah.
About the reorganization of the genome.
So it doesn't. You can go as far as the natural genetic engineering of Jim Shapiro, that organisms actively rewrite their DNA sequence. But if you go all the way down to orchestrating the activity of their genes, the expression of their genes without modifying the sequence, you've still done 99.9% of the work.
Exactly, because the code is
right.
Code is all the requests for RNA that the cell is making.
It's
right?
Like
code is not where they're reading the RNA from, but it's which RNAs to get at what times.
It's like the difference. Like, it would be great if you could say, look, this is the sequence you need in order to make the protein you need at the right time. In order to do this, just do that. Like, just do it in a direct natural genetic engineering sort of way. But in the absence of that, if you can say, this is the gene where a change is needed, that's 99.9% of the work, right? You can do random variation selection to do that. I could believe that. But if you don't have that, then you say like, well, I figured out how to do something, like with my brain, for example. It didn't have any effect on anything else except electrical activity in my brain, right? Now that's hard to say, okay, now find a genetic mutation which reduces my need to do that, or reduces the amount of learning time necessary for me to do that with my brain. Like that would be hard, right? Like in principle, if a mutation arose which enabled you to reduce the amount of learning or that was needed, then it would assimilate that phenotypically acquired adaptation.
But isn't that epigenetic inheritance too? I mean, you know, if we have these mechanisms for methylating the sperm and the egg.
Yes,
Yeah.
there absolutely are. You know, and another thing is that ultimately, if you're just talking about your sequence of DNA, and Rosen has an argument about why that isn't as much as we think it is, but you're still eventually essentially talking about digital information, right? And the question arises in complex systems and living systems, how much you can actually know just from the digital information.
Totally. Yeah. Totally.
You know, because there's incompleteness arguments, and there's the types of arguments that Rosen makes as well in life itself. That while perhaps not 100% absolutely right, there's certainly worth listening to.
Well, the beautiful part is of a learning first theory is everything doesn't have to be in a digital form, right? It could be in an analog form, and then later the problem that Richard's raising comes in, which is, I agree, is a problem. We need to write a paper about this.
Charlie, I'm dying to hear what Bill has to say. He's hit his hand up like 10
Oh,
times.
sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. I'm not.
I want to upset you all because I want to claim that I'm Karl Popper's love child. So that's said for amusement, obviously. But if you want answers to the questions, I offer this. All of the questions. Karl Popper is just unbelievably brilliant because he intuited in 1934 things that could only be really explained in the 21st century. There's no way for him to know that all cells are intelligent. Every single living cell is intelligent and has been since the origin of life.
Yep.
Which book did you hold up, Bill? Did you hold up The Sentient Cell? It has a different cover than mine. What is it? I can't see.
This is cognition-based evolution.
Cognition-based evolution.
It's the entire theory, and the brilliance of Popper has one limitation, because he didn't know exactly how to express the very basal aspect of cognition. He couldn't consider fully all of its entailment. So, for example, he says living organisms are conjectures. Well, that's true, but what they actually are is predictions. When you start with cognition at the very base, you no longer have neo-Darwinism at all. There is no natural selection, because when cognition is at the base, then the decisions cells are making, and cells are making decisions, and they are problem solving, and that's not conjectural, that's actual, then that's cognitive selection. So you have internal agency, and that's the propulsive force in evolution. And what we termed natural selection and all of its entailments is simply a filter, a post facto filter. It's no, natural selection no more makes choices about living forms than a colander decides what spaghetti is going to be left inside the colander. It's post facto. The issue of all biology, once you know that cognition is its beginning, is how does cognition yield variations? That's biology.
Yeah,
That's
he wrote, I mean, he actually wrote, and it's in the Nyman book, that, you know, he felt even the simplest form of life, you know, has activity, which he defined as teleological agency, basically.
You sent out some wonderful quotes.
Yeah.
And here's one that's particularly important, which forms the basis of cognition-based evolution. He says, organisms are problem solvers. Organisms seek better conditions. All of these are roughly teleological terms. And that one sentence, with all of its codicils that extend from it, explains everything you need to know about evolution when you put it into the framework of the cognitive cell. All organisms are problem solvers, and we know that's a fact because all organisms are cell-based and all cells solve problems.
Totally.
What problem are they solving? They are
Yeah.
consistently sustaining preferential states of homeoetic flux. Preferential states. No one talks about preference in biology, but preference is the underpinning of all of biology. Cells have preferences.
That's right.
Totally.
So when
Yeah.
I say I'm Karl Popper's love
Agential.
child, it's because I'm looking at, I was a physician for 35, 40 years, and I'm looking at patterns of disease and noticing that I can predict certain microorganisms are causing certain diseases because of where their predilections, their preferences.
Their preferences.
From a conjecture that was considered an absurdity by my partners that I expressed it to. And now comes an entire framework of evolution that is not neo-Darwinian.
Totally.
And because organisms are problem solving, decision making, and sustaining states of preference, which multicellular beings like ourselves are, we are natural cellular, viral cellular engineering products. There are niche constructions as habitats of states of preference. We are predictions vis-a-vis environmental stresses. And we return information back, and this Popper could not know. We return the information that's vital to the next set of learned sequences through the unilateral, the obligatory recapitulation through the unicell. Why does every multicellular organism go through a single cell stage again?
It doesn't.
It does.
No, it doesn't.
Which organism does not go through a single cell
Like
stage?
planaria.
If this one of those conjectures that just one counterexample makes your conjecture false?
I would just give me an example of an organism, a multicellular organism that does not revisit the single cell stage.
Planaria and many plants.
Exactly.
Many plants. Yeah.
That-
Slime mold.
But I think they do.
Well, you
at
mean
some
because they
point in
have
time,
egg-
have the
they-
ability to reproduce in a unicellular
Just
way.
because they can regenerate doesn't
Or
mean
are there some that don't?
Well, you're
That's
talking about the
regeneration.
budding process.
Well, look what you do, Bill. If you want to define reproduction as you go through a unicellular stage, then you can't be wrong.
That's right. That's very Popperian.
Nice. Nice. Beautiful.
well.
That's
As I said earlier, it fits what we know, and it provides a useful framework for making decisions of our own about how to deal with biology.
I mean, I think, yeah,
I don't think any of us.
I mean, senescence.
There's extraordinary explanatory value to understanding why the unicellular stage is revisited.
I agree with you, Bill. I agree with you, Bill, because of senescence. Because of senescence is so hard to explain, right? I mean, for some reason the conjecture has to start over at some point. And
Yes.
we have these conjectures that are perfectly good that are walking around, and then they just self-destruct and die.
Yeah, my colleagues and I published that paper. Actually, it's why aging and death.
Yeah, why?
And
Right.
progress.
Yeah.
Bill,
In the
Not
Red
accidental
Queen, they
death, but
argue
programmed
that
death.
in the Red Queen, they argue that the purpose of returning to a single cell is because of the risk of carrying parasites from previous generations. And even though the egg and its cytoplasm does carry the potential parasites, but the male sperm sucks off all of that in order to make sure that there's no parasites closing the loop. That's what they argued.
That's because parasites can evolve so much faster than hosts. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, these are awesome points, and let me try to finish. Let me try to finish my let me try to finish my presentation super quick because I'm about to take Popper into a very revolutionary to do some revolutionary work here. So what I would maintain is that we basically live in an inductivist dominated world, both in science and in the broader culture. everyone defines knowledge as something that's like written as a code, you know, as a Shannon information binary code. Everyone thinks of computation. Everyone thinks of cognition as basically computation, computing the best predicted way to survive and reproduce as an organism. And the pinnacle of this form of reasoning, or the way of thinking, is Bayesian reasoning. And that's why they call this artificial intelligence. They call it intelligence because they think that's what intelligence is, right? It's computation of the probability of survival and reproduction. And so if that were true, there are some consequences to the world being Bayesian, and there are very different consequences to cognition being Popperian. And so I want to try to imagine real quick, just in a sketchy way, the different consequences of cognition as a Bayesian process versus cognition as a Popperian process. So let's say, for instance, I'm a toddler. I'm 1.5 years old, and I look out the window every morning, and my mother, and this is what I see, and my mother tells me it's a cow. Right? So 100 times this happens. And for 100 times, I have this intimate association of a cow with spruce branches, because the only cows I've ever seen are behind the spruce tree, right? And I don't know that. I don't have any way to distinguish right from wrong, you know? So, I mean, true from false. So if I'm a Bayesian, if my brain is a Bayesian reasoning algorithm, then what's happened is 100 times I've created a nearly unbreakable association between spruce branches and cows. And then the next day, the 101st day, my mother takes me out on the porch and I see the cow standing in the field, and I don't see spruce branches around the cow. So in a Bayesian world, my probabilities have been updated, right? There's a 99% chance that cows have to do with spruce branches, and then there's a 1% chance that cows don't have to do with anything to do with spruce branches. And here's where you can see the powerful asymmetry of proof between Bayesian reasoning and Popperian reasoning. Because if the child is a Popperian reasoning system, then even one example is enough to completely refute the idea that cows and spruce branches have to be together. So the kid goes outside and sees a cow in the field by itself, has to invent a new conjecture because its whole worldview has been refuted. It's surprised. It has to invent a new explanation wherein a cow can either be by itself or in a tree, right? So that it requires a whole new way of framing the question. And if you think about it, how many examples are we going to need to reframe the question for a Bayesian system? Well, if we've got 100 examples with the spruce branches, then we're going to have at least 10,000 examples without the spruce branches before we ever learn anything accurate, before we get rid of that specious association. So there's another problem in not being able to distinguish between like truth, my eyes are fooling me, and my eyes are not fooling me, which is a Popperian distinction. You know, the Popperian can do this gestalt switching now between the cow is in the tree versus the cow is behind the tree, right? The Popperian system can now disbelieve its eyes. And so certain data that it's taking in have incredible meaning. So that 101st example had an incredible, powerful meaning for the Popperian system. Whereas for the Bayesian system, it was just another observation to be put in the bank, statistically analyzed, just like all the rest. And so the origin of this meaning is why I'm claiming that the Popperian epistemology solves the Chinese room problem. So the Chinese room problem is this thought experiment from John Searle at UCLA, who said, well, what you're doing with artificial intelligence is not intelligence because there's no semantics. It's just syntax. You're just moving data. And what's the difference between handing messages into a room in Chinese, and I have no ability to read Chinese, but I look up the characters and then I translate the answer character by character and hand them back out. I have no idea what's going on out there. So he used that argument to say AI doesn't know anything. It's not creating meaning. It's not creating any understanding. It's just translating symbols according to a syntax. It's not creating what we would think of as a model of the world. All it's creating is this data structure. So let's think about what the data structure is in Bayesian reasoning versus what the presumably some sort of structure, maybe not data, it's an analog structure in a Popperian system. So the Bayesian system is doing prediction, right? Like its whole purpose is based on, its whole architecture is based on the assumption that the future will resemble the past. And so that's committing the irrational error of induction that we talked about at the beginning, but it's basically doing that because it's assuming that all the past experience is directly telling it what to predict is going to happen in the future. So events are assigned probabilities of occurring. It builds a mathematical model. It requires massive data because it has to overcome these specious associations, right? It can't refute anything and throw it out. It has to just process more and more and more and more until you have to eat the whole internet to, produce anything that sounds like a person. It's naive. It's not able to disbelieve its own eyes. It can't do a Gestalt switching between the cow is here versus there. It can only see it one way because it's just a bunch of pixels. So it also doesn't have the ability to anticipate or seek out novelty, pursue novelty. And it seeks predictable conditions. If the basis of cognition is entirely Bayesian, then all it's doing is seeking predictable conditions, right? It's just trying to do homeostasis. And so that introduces this dark room problem, which is why would an organism not seek out the most predictable conditions it can find if the whole point of the Bayesian system is to, minimize surprise and minimize, disruption, then an organism should go into a dark room and just sip through a straw at a steady rate and, breathe at a steady rate and poop at a steady rate and just ignore everything that's disturbing the prediction, right? Seeking out, and same thing with internal states, right? They should be just aiming for a total steady state. So that's the dark room problem, and it's not been solved. So yeah, experience is a record of everything, and the theory behind the whole tech sector is basically now that AGI is just a matter of processing more and more data so we can get closer and closer to what a human does, which is, predict its own survival value.
Two things.
Yes.
Real quick, Charlie.
Okay.
I just sent you 3 papers from Terry Deacon, who he sent me about 8 years ago. Who, by the way,
I love his book.
He's very influenced by both Peirce and by Gregory Bateson. This is on semantic versus syntactic conceptions of information. This work
Totally, yeah.
And I would, so your argument is it's related to some arguments that Kate Nave makes in her new book, which it's an argument. Well, it discusses a lot about what active inference can and can't tell you, and this is kind of related to the AI question. Actually, we probably should discuss that book together at some point. Okay. Yeah, I only bring this up now because I can't really stay a lot longer because my wife and I have plans, so I'm gonna have to leave soon.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, thanks for coming, Wayne. Richard?
Thank you very much, Charlie. I found that cow in the bushes example very helpful. I totally get that position. I did not appreciate the difference between a Popperian versus Bayesian way of doing reasoning or information acquisition, and that helps a lot. However, I know what the Chinese room problem is and the distinction that it makes between semantic information and syntactic, but I didn't get how doing reasoning in a Popperian way makes the Chinese room problem go away.
Totally. So yes, this is the coolest part. Okay. And it involves Stephen's work. And Mary thinks it has to be a whole different meeting, but I think that there's a magic answer here that we're like we have to get this deep, as deep as we've already, taken us an hour, but now we're here and we're ready to see this. So there's something magic happening, right? There's something very different about a Popperian system with these conjectures and this Bayesian system with just data. Okay, so the conjectures, they organize data in a very, very special way into like these entities and forces. And what the entities and forces mean is that certain things are impossible, right? So it's not a predictive model at all. It's a Popperian conjecture is something that says it doesn't define what's possible either. It defines what's impossible. So that's why it's falsifiable, is because it very carefully says this thing cannot happen, right? So if the little boy had this conjecture about the tree and the cow, it's like the conjecture is that there can be no cow without tree. That's impossible. And so if he has that, it's a possibilitative model, I would call it, because I like to make up words. So it's like, it's very, very different from predictive model, right? Because the predictive model is always going to point you back to the tree. So you've got to have this possibilitative model, which is, open-ended, but it says there can't be, the cow can't be without the tree. And if he sees it without the tree, he's like, oh my God, and then he wants to pursue that and find out more refutations of the new theory and make it up. So,
Charlie, one thing that Popper does, I think, really well. Boy, I'm like groggy today. I'm just losing my train of thought.
well, he makes internal contradictions possible, right? A Bayesian system has no such thing as an internal contradiction. It just accepts all the new data
here's what
at face value.
What Popper brings out is that there is really no such thing as objective data. Like you have to have a model, so you build a model, you have a worldview, and then you're going to build a bunch of experiments within that worldview, and then this is data. But the Bayesian models, they try to just say, they act as if the data is objective and they're just making observations. They're looking for very specific things.
Right.
If you look for this, you're going to see this. If you look for that, you're going to maybe see something entirely different.
Exactly.
Are there any?
Yeah. And so the data asymmetry is wild. Like when you think about how much data it takes to train a Bayesian system to sound like a human, a human learns to read on a set of books that can fit inside one small room, and that's a well-educated human. But a Bayesian system has to eat the entire internet and more, and keeps wanting more and more, in order to do that. And that's because there are no internal contradictions in the data that it's consuming, right? It just updates probabilities. So the Popperian system makes this truth-lie distinction because there's certain things that are impossible. And when those are upset, it has to reorganize itself. So this obviously, it requires eating data in some wildly different way. And that's what has excited me from the beginning when I first discovered Steve's work, because what you see in this harmonic gestalt is you see a way that what appears as passively absorbed data gets reified and extended in a way that two structures can conflict with one another and become impossible together, right? So you have to flip between two gestalt images, like, C's worm or whatever, or the duck rabbit, is my favorite example. Because it can't be a duck and a rabbit at the same time. It's got to either be a duck or a rabbit. There's an internal contradiction once you introduce harmonic resonance that it creates within this field of otherwise passive data. It creates an internal, the possibility of contradiction. It causes something to be impossible that wouldn't have been impossible for a Bayesian system. And so for a Popperian system, experience is not a record of everything that's happened. It's a record of major surprises that contradicted its possibilitive model, right? So the things you remember, you know, from your average day, you remember like 0.0001% of a day, you know, and all you remember are the things we call events. There's no such thing as an event for a Bayesian system, but for a Popperian system, an event is something that surprised you, something that seemed, and you know, it doesn't have to be an extreme impossible, like it doesn't have to be you saw a UFO, you know, but anything that surprised your model.
Bill has his hand up, but I wanted to say really quickly, I wanted, after we hear from Bill,
Totally.
has anyone ever looked at Popper and Whitehead in the same sort of thought space? Because there seems to be a lot of resonance there. Bill, what were you going to say?
Well, I'm hoping to offer some clarification for Richard, and the way I see the differences in the slide that Charlie had up, Popperian truly lives in the living frame. He uses words that are not computer linked, words like organisms seeking better conditions.
Right.
The kind of expectation. He goes, I think of our organs, even our internal organs, develop a kind of knowledge, a kind of long-term expectation. And so Charlie mentioned surprise, and the concept of surprisal is exactly what separates AI from the living frame, and why AI is not ever going to be conscious unless it gets married to living cells. The absolute fundamental difference is they use completely different types of information. Computers are using digital information, and just think of it in your own mind's eye. You all know it's a sharp square waveform, sharp ups and sharp downs. Our living frame is based on irreducible uncertainties. We spend our lives trying to minimize surprisal. Kristen's wonderful idea has great legs within the living frame. And so the analog waveform that is our life, our living condition, is something that computers have not learned to match, and even fuzzy logic within computers is in no way similar. So computers will learn to imitate us so gorgeously that we will not be able to easily detect the difference, but they'll never be alive because there's no internal surprise.
Right.
Yes.
Totally. Yeah, totally. This is, yeah. This is making me suspicious because this whole presentation is going over way too smoothly with you.
Great.
Well, we're all Popperian.
It's very, very useful. Thank you. Mm.
The thing that you helped me to articulate that really bothers me about the Bayesian is that it's so biased by what its initial experiences are.
Right.
And it takes a really long time statistically. You folks, I haven't had enough statistics to explain this, but I know that this is true. It takes a really long time statistically to take over to overtake an early anomaly and to come up with a model that is actually predictive.
You know, there's a hidden weakness in AI, and I don't regard myself as being specifically knowledgeable about AI architecture and how they build their language models, but you know, every computer needs to reboot, and every living organism does too.
Yeah.
Charlie mentioned the problems with information, the need to kind of clear the decks on information as one cause of senescence, which is entirely correct as far as I'm concerned. AI doesn't have a really good reboot system. It's more like a zero totality alphabet.
Right.
And so it goes reticular to reticular. It would almost be what would happen to planaria if you kept on chopping them up and they regenerate and regenerate and regenerate. Eventually, they will fall apart because there's no error correction system. The error correction system for living organism is the zygote. It gets us back to fundamental cellular principles that we have yet to fully understand or only beginning to glimpse. AI doesn't have that. So it has all of the biases of the programmers, and it goes from generation to generation accumulating biases. And I really wonder what will happen over time. How will it deviate? And how will skillful human engineers refocus it? AI is a problem.
Brilliant idea. I think that you should write a paper on that, Bill, about why AI should be collapsed and start again from first
I'm not
principles.
smart enough. I need a smarter collaborator. I can't do it.
It's a brilliant idea. I have to tell my Freud story. This is quick. My next door neighbor growing up, Hetty Reese, was an ancient Austrian woman, and she tells the story of when she lived next door to the Freuds when she was growing up, and she would go over and help with things in the house. And one time Sigmund asked her to put a heavy blindfold on her, and he asked her to turn around, and he turned her in different directions. Then he asked her to say which direction she was facing, and she could always tell. And he was amazed by this. I'm sure he had some theory about women being, closer, to animal nature and being more like the birds or whatever his theory was. So he took her out to a scientific conference, and he had her present, before his peers, and she couldn't tell which direction she was facing. And he became really irate, and he asked her what the difference was. And she said, well, when you turned me at home, every time I banged into the desk and I could tell which direction I was facing. But basically, Popper says that in his writings that he was inspired by the difference between Freud and Einstein, because Freud could take any data that was lying around and make it fit whatever theory he had. Your ability to bond to your parents was predicated on both having too much attention from your parents and too little attention. And yet here we have Freud, who's come up with so many provocative ideas that still, he goes in and out of fashion, but you still can't avoid some of them because he just had his hunches coming from whatever the primordial substance is that Popper didn't care what it came from. But I thought it was hilarious.
They have this notion in the law of circumstantial evidence. So you got all these little tiny pieces of information. Each one suggests this or that, or each one's a separate piece. But if you put it all together, you say, well, the window was open in the bedroom, and there was a cigarette butt in the toilet, and you put it all together and you get the whole scenario. That's an emergent Gestalt process, very much like, are you guys familiar with the dog picture? Familiar in vision circles? It's a black and white photo of a dog under under a tree with shaded. Yeah. And you look at it, and there's no way you could prove in a court of law that there's a dog there, but there it is. There's the dog, and it's really circumstantial evidence that goes all the way back down to, the lowest levels of sensory perception. And so I would be inclined to say that in this Bayesian versus Popperian, it's not really a dichotomy. They are linked together so closely that the minute you begin to perceive something, your mind constructs something bigger, which then changes the percept and so on and so forth, and it all happens. And our difficulty is when we get stuck on this issue of, positive realism, where you believe that nothing is true unless you can prove it. Well, forget everything, because, you can't prove anything. But on the other hand, how can you perceive anything if you don't have any preconceptions? Well, our brain and body are built with the preconceptions built in, that we prefer to see things as edges or as corners, and rather than just random stuff. So I think the true solution to this is both. They're both the Bayesian and the Popperian. The Bayesian is very much like the dog picture. Every little edge suggests a longer edge if it can hook up with one, and you do that all at the same time. That's the Bayesian aspect of it. But then, and there's a dog. That's the Popperian aspect of it, because you're starting to form a picture of what's there, and that influences your interpretation, and again and again and again, until it all comes out. And we can't record it in a court of law. We can't record it in mathematical equations, because it's a Gestalt process.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that makes me just love Popper so much is that, for me, it frees it frees us up. Like it removes all the constraints, because when you're doing this thing that masquerades as induction, you know, all it is just wild dreaming, right? It's wild conjecturing, and the wilder, the better. The more like out of the box, you know, theory of space-time and, you know, magnetism and harmonic resonance and everything else, the more wacky it is, the better, because you're always safe. The minute it can be refuted, it can disappear. So you don't have to only make statements that are, you know, corroborated by all sorts of observations. You can make wild statements and just weed them out until you have something that's dramatically new that forms a good explanation. And I think if we actually did this, then science would move like 10 times faster than it actually does.
So-
If we focused on making good explanations that could be refuted quickly, you know, then we could just, you know, the minute the Weissman barrier is broken, we just throw that whole theory away and get on with imagining the new one.
So Charlie, to deploy what you just suggested, I've been really struck since the last presentation. I've been looking at lots of papers, both in material science and in biology, which the thinking is so different, it makes my head hurt, at condensates, coacervates, and liquid crystals, and feeling like somebody should write a book. Somebody should write a book and do some kind of a survey of how many, you know, it seems like there are folks who understand that are interested in looking at coacervates as liquid crystals and condensates as, you know, liquid crystals, but there doesn't seem to be anybody who believes that or has looked at to see how much those processes in biology are liquid crystals all the time. And it almost seems like a lot of the time when folks look, the liquid crystals show up. And it seems to me like we could answer a lot of the sort of, I'm making a wild conjecture. My wild conjecture is that there's something about the learning and information storage and processing in the crystal form that is really important to basic processes like in mitosis and meiosis. And if we were looking at these if we were looking to see where the liquid crystals show up, and especially how information, to prove that there's something about the crystal form where there's learning and memory, I think that we could have a real movement forward in science. And I was just thinking, I might just do it myself, just a literature review to see how often the liquid crystal form has been demonstrated to show up in various processes in the body might just make a huge difference in leaping us forward.
Mary Lin has been having conversations with Bruce Damer recently about his theories for the origin of life in wet-dry cycling of pools.
Yeah.
He describes the lamellar formation of lipid membranes in the gel stage as moving between crystalline and aqueous.
I've been reading about exactly this, the lamellar formation, thinking that this is a key.
So he says, you know, it is a liquid crystal, but it's not, oh, I found a liquid crystal, now we're done. It's the oscillating back and forth across that transition boundary from the liquid phase to the crystal phase.
This is what I've been seeing, Richard, is that they seem to appear and disappear. And the fact that in water, we've been able to, Pollock's team was able to dry out the H3O2. I think it would be really interesting to do, to look at if there's a way to sort of dry out the lamellar crystals, which are lipid, and see if there's something that exists, and then to do studies to see if they change based on various learning. Like if you put a cell through, you know, a certain series of stresses or trials, and then you dried out its liquid crystals, you know, from the water and from the lipid phase and from the protein phase and from, you know, the amino acid, you know, phases, and see if there's a difference, and to see if there's a difference in what happens when you the number of cycles and how you make the cycles happen. It just seems like there's so much here that could be looked at.
So can I say a couple of things which made sense to me and one thing that still doesn't? So I have no problem at all with the conclusion that AI as it is has no grounding for any of its symbols.
Annie Grangiero or Seacoast Flight Medicine.
Pardon me.
And I have no problem at all with the idea that living organisms do have grounded symbols, tokens, items, conjectures, whatever it is that they're working with are grounded because of their grounding in the body in which they're built, and that's where the conjectures come from. For me, that means that the thing that passes the Searle's Chinese room refinement of the Turing test, the thing that passes that is something which isn't substrate independent, right? So the reason that AI has symbols which aren't grounded is because it assumes that cognition is an algorithm which is substrate independent. And living things are not substrate independent because it's the substrate is where they get their conjectures from. Mm-hmm. The substrate is, that's where the conjectures pop up. So that's all fits very happily with my way of understanding things. It also makes sense to me that a Bayesian model can't have an internal contradiction. And I understand how the Gestalt harmonic stuff can have internal contradictions. So that's very cool. I like that. However, I don't see how you get directly from the idea that a Popperian model can have internal contradictions. And because of that, that means that the symbols mean something and that the symbols are grounded. That seems like there was still a little bit of a leap there.
Well, the meaning comes from the refutation, right? The contradiction. So a refutation is meaningful. So it means that everything we notice, our attention only goes to refutations because it's a possibilitative model. We can accept, I can drive down the road and drive past 10 million trees and accept all of them without noticing them, but the minute I see a tree with its leaves standing on the ground and its roots sticking up in the air, I'm like, oh my God, or whatever, anything that's impossible is shocking and amazing and noteworthy. And then we remember it sometimes forever. And it's because we had to come up with a new conjecture on the spot to explain the world. We had to reorganize our conjecture, which is, if we're saying it's these objects, abstract objects that are reified through harmonic resonance, they have to be rearranged. And then there's something involving sleep and dreaming that, is really required for them to fit together long term. And to me, perception is refutation, right? The conjecture part is still mysterious. We don't know where it's coming from, but what we're noticing is just the refutations. We're just noticing the upside down trees. Sorry, all my examples are trees right now.
You live in Vermont and you're a wood and work with trees. So, but it seems to me remember when we were talking about the difference between looking at the harmonic scale. Remember when I was talked about the difference between the Bolin, we were talking about looking at harmonic resonance and we're just looking at the periodicities and the overtones and the resonance that shows up when we just look at it in octaves. But then I brought up the Bolin Pierce, and Stephen said, well, there is something innate about the octaval look at it because these overtones show up really readily and we recognize them really readily, but the others are like in the Bolin Pierce, it feels more artificial, but it's because there's a more subtle level, sort of like a next level of looking at and understanding the resonances. It seems to me that, and here's my wild conjecture, is that if we are harmonic resonance perceiving machines, then we are going to have our basic simple settings that we add to and are accretive, and we have one, but when we see something that's outside of that, we have to create a different attunement to a different level of the harmonic resonance of the whole in order to be able to bring that into our attention.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, because the most normal thing to do with anomalies is just dismiss them.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, just put them away and say they didn't exist. Like, I didn't see it. It wasn't
Yeah.
a black swan. It was something else.
Or you can say, how do I bring this into my story? And I mean, organisms are storytelling. We have to make it make sense. I mean, Charlie, you and I talked about this, that, of the study that, the studies that show that when you put electrodes like into the temporal lobes of the motor cortex, and somebody's leg starts jumping, and then they're asked, why'd your leg jump? You make up a story about that, and the story doesn't have anything to do with this random probe. It's that, oh, well, I'm feeling nervous about my test later. So we have to create a story. We're trying to fit something into a larger story, and we can think of the stories as the harmonic resonance, right? That we're
Totally.
able to attune to at any one time.
Let me offer my simplistic point of view. It harkens back to a comment that Steve made, which interested me deeply. It's impossible to talk about living systems without getting back to the concept of preference. And so the concept of contradictions is simply a living principle. For example, I could state to you, I just read 10 articles about the dangers of drinking, and before I read the 11th, I'm going to pour myself a glass of wine. That's what humans do. This is the living frame. And in part because, and this I think is a vastly underestimated aspect of biology, living systems have experiences, and they have preferences, and that's valence. And valence comes from a very directly measurable principle. All cells measure information. We can experiment that, we can test it, we could refute it if it was incorrect. But we do know cells measure internally. It's called infocomputation. It actually has been measured and experimented on and tested in a variety of ways. When cells measure, they're making a discrimination of two things: amplitude of an environmental cue, but they're also putting a value on it, an internal self-referential value. So it is both computation in the sense of a Bayesian way of looking at things, and it's experiential, a long-term expectation, a form of expectation and preference with valence. And the two are united. So Steve was saying that the two are absolutely united in the living frame. We really can't separate them.
Right.
You can't, because you're a cellular being. And I can offer to you the science of cells, which is discretely provable, that shows that these processes are one and the same. They're concurrent, and they go through the same receptive mechanism of the external cellular membrane and its linked apparatus. František Beluška and I have dubbed that the cenome. It's a well-articulated and peer-reviewed theory. That's the living frame. And so contradiction isn't a bug in the system. It's based on the uncertainty of all biological information. We can never know its absolute value because it's always degraded as it travels from its source to our cellular interior. And there's lots of noise along the way. Cells measure information because it's uncertain, and they assign value and valence. And from that comes internal contradictions and different forms of reasoning to problem solve. And I think Popper really intuited all this so brilliantly. I'm in awe of someone that could do this in 1934.
So
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, the
I have to ask,
problem, in order for a problem to exist, there has to be a contradiction, and the contradiction just, it can't be there in Bayesian reasoning because they just blindly gobble up everything and average it all together. And so
Bill, I'm really interested in the problem with valence. I want to know how the cells do it. What is the equivalent of the cell's limbic system that tells us something's important before we decide it is?
It's their cenome. It's in the book that I held up, or you can just look it up on Genome under Google Scholar.
Is your Bill, is your book? I think
It's not out yet, is it? In a
I
couple,
ordered your book on Amazon, but it was like a pre-order.
yeah.
No, it's available. It's
Amazon says it's
the
pre-order.
problem is you have to sell your house to buy it.
You have to.
It's expensive. I'll mail you a copy.
No, but
I would love to read it. I'll read it today.
I think I paid for it though, but Amazon hasn't sent it to me yet.
Well, I can offer anyone who likes it. I can just send today. I think I have a pre-proof or something.
I'd
that
love
I
to
can
read it.
send,
Awesome.
and I'd be
Yeah.
happy to share it. Just let me know you want it, and I'll send it.
I want it.
I definitely want it. So Bill, this seems to me like this is a place where I studied somatics for years. From folks who, started in physiotherapy and occupational therapy, and my ability to know things in my body and my tissues before I can logically describe them is pretty well developed. And and people talk about, Shermer, like, was the first person I was reading in the 90s. So he was talking about the limbic system and how we process information there before we know something. But I feel it in my body. And I've always been very interested in this question of how that gets, what are the different methodologies the body uses to create an additive knowing that comes out as, a singular thought or a singular sort of like.
And the answer to that within my framework is we are the aggregate of trillions of cells that can work seamlessly together, even of different species, because our microbiome affects our mood and our behavior.
Yeah.
We cannot survive without it. We can't live without it, and they can't live as they prefer outside of us. And it's a very, all multicellular eukaryotes are holobionts.
Right, we're all holobionts.
So you're a product of all of those forces together. So we know that you're the product of those forces, but the answer to that, how does it exactly yield you? We don't know that. That part we don't know. It happens, and you're living proof of it.
Right.
But I don't know. I do know that I can't know you. I cannot interrogate your consciousness through my consciousness. You are separated from me by definition, because consciousness is a cellular phenomena, and you can't get inside the cell and interrogate that consciousness without disrupting it. There's no means of doing so.
I want to ask you some questions that are partially from the somatic world and partially shamanic. One of the things that I learned from Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who's been studying this for 50 years, is that you can tune into an organizational level in your body that she calls a consciousness of system. Like you can tune into the consciousness of your liver, or, I mean, she talks to her islets of Langerhans. I mean, she gets down into like all the different cells of each of the in the pancreas or whatever. And, but I can tune into that and have a feeling of knowing, and then know something that I need to eat or something I need to do. And then years later, I look it up and I find out that the research has shown that such and such nutrient has such and such effect in the body. And she taught us how to look at people and tell whether or not they're focused in their their connective tissue or in their cerebrospinal fluid, and I find that it's very interesting and very useful. And I don't know if I'm actually picking up what she said or something else and then making up a story a la Freud, but I do feel and myself like I can tune into the mind of my of my fascia and feel it. And then I can feel that in other people. And when I do shamanic work, that's part of what happens. And there's no explanation for it. My biological, my part of me that's interested in biology thinks it's hilarious. And I tell people I'm making up stories. I don't really know what's happening, but I just felt like I wanted to throw that into the mix.
Well, I understand exactly what you're saying. And I only offer this personal point of view. I know that I'm an aggregate of the consciousness of the trillions of cells that make me. I also know there are, within our body, there are non-local correlations that exist, that these are quantum, they're electron tunneling, they're quantum related. So I know that those quantum systems, which include quantum non-locality, are operative within my body. That's on an experimental basis. And I've long believed that to seek truth, we've always looked to really understand ourselves. We've been looking through telescopes to try to really understand our basic nature. And I think it's useful. But I've always felt that we would understand ourselves much better. I'm talking about our philosophical selves.
Yes.
By looking inward. And I'm not convinced that meditation goes to a higher plane. I'm thinking it goes to an inner plane.
Well, that's always been my experience.
As a sliding scale of consciousness, which I can't say that I understand, but that's my personal perspective.
I've been a meditator for 40 years almost as well. And my experience has been that the more I perceive the collection of sentiences for whom I am responsible, the closer those awarenesses on the cellular level are to my meditative, metaphysical perceptions as well.
Well, I'm open to it. Again, I'm perfectly willing to say when I don't know, and this is a circumstance where I just have a preferential conjecture, which pleases me that it goes both directions and it has equal validity in both directions. But it's just a feeling.
Yeah, it's just a feeling. I would love at some point to do some somatic work with people and teach this other system, like where you can tune into the mind of the spleen and the mind of, and to see how that changes your consciousness. Like you have this palpable, different like beingness that you have when you go into these different systems. It's pretty fascinating work.
We'll see. I don't know.
Totally.
Charlie,
Right,
thank you. This was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for including me.
Oh, absolutely, Bill. Thank you for coming. Hey,
Thanks,
Steve, I have a question for you before you leave. You're muted right now. You're muted.
Didn't touch anything.
Oh, there we go. Hey.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there.
So I'm gonna see you Friday night, huh?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Do you think there's any chance you could work up a tiny presentation on harmonic gestalt? Like just that part of it, the multi-stability reification.
I'm going to bounce too. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks so much, Mary.
Good to see you.
And I do want your book. So if you could, can you send the PDF to Charlie and he can send it to, or just send it to us? You have our emails.
You can count on it. Thank you. Thank you for asking. I'll do it right now.
All right.
Awesome.
See everyone later.
Thanks, guys.
Well, I'm going to see you in San Fran, right?
Yeah. Friday night or Saturday morning. If
they said for a brief presentation, I'm preparing like a 10-minute thing that will be basically on, holistic intelligence and how it relates to harmonic resonance and so forth. So would that do for your requirement?
Well, I want to, because I want to give a hopefully better version of what I did today. But I want to end on your theory. I want to end on harmonic gestalt and show how a contradiction is possible within a Popperian system if it's based on harmonic gestalt.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, we can talk about that in San Fran, right?
Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll see you later. Good to see you.
Okay, fantastic. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.